Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 39. We're going to be talking about the 2018 Ari Aster film Hereditary. As we mentioned in our previous episode, this was to be done in conjunction with the Deadly Analysis podcast, and scheduling just made it a little too rough to come together. So it's going to just be Chad and I, and we hope to do something collaborative with those guys down the road. Next episode, we are going to be talking about Unsane from 2018, the Steven Soderbergh film, which strangely, I feel like nobody's actually seen that movie.
I have not seen it yet.
Most people haven't even heard of it.
I hadn't heard about it until you said, hey, this movie, there's something. I don't know that I love it, but there's something. You said
I think
something
it's
like that.
totally worth seeing and totally worth talking about. I would never call it a great movie, but I'm really glad I saw it, and I'm actually really excited to talk about it. I will also say, for our more dedicated listeners, it wouldn't hurt to also read or listen to the audiobook of The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, which is a fantastic book, actually, but it's very connected to the movie. You can write us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. And for Unsane, would encourage you all to send in questions, things you'd like us to address in that episode. At the end of this episode, we're going to be taking the questions we were sent about Hereditary. Do you have anything to plug?
Nothing.
Me neither.
Yeah. Wow, that's kind of rare. Usually we have something going on.
I know. This is a good time to be us.
Well, I do have one thing to plug. I'm now a minister, so I can perform wedding ceremonies. If anybody's out there getting married and needs someone to perform their wedding ceremony, I've performed one, and it went fucking awesome. So congratulations to Nicholas and Jason. I know Nicholas listens to the show sometimes.
Hey, Nick. Congrats.
Yeah, and they are currently in Paris having fun.
Nice. And they couldn't have done it without you.
Well, they could have done it without me, but it was definitely done much better with me. So
no doubt.
So yeah. So just get at me. You can use that same email address, @scarythoughts. I'm comfortable with all sorts of like bizarre rituals and stuff. We did a broom jumping at this last.
Really?
Oh yeah, it was awesome.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, and as is my way, I go into like way too much research on anything I do, and so I like learn this whole history of the broom jumping, and yeah, it's kind of like one of my favorite ones was that two people jump, and whoever jumps higher, it's like the spirit saying who will wear the pants in the relationship.
Oh,
and so it's mostly, it's oriented towards men.
Slightly.
Yeah. But when it goes the other way, hilarity ensues.
Good.
Yeah.
I encourage you all to go to scarythoughts.org, sign up for our newsletter up on the top right corner. Send a newsletter out with every episode with recommendations, summary of the episode, little tidbits. Also, a warning to you all, spoilers ahead. We are not reviewing Hereditary. We're going to be discussing the film and leaving nothing hidden.
Yeah, and this movie is, as of this recording, still in the theater, which is really unusual for us.
Yeah.
So get out there, get at it.
Yeah, and there's actually lots to spoil. So where do you want to start?
I guess where I would start is the opening scene is interesting to me.
How's that?
Because you know how sometimes movies sort of tell you what the movie's about in the first 15 minutes?
Yeah,
It's like it's basically like the classic 3-act structure. You introduce a knife in Act 1, and someone gets stabbed with it in Act 3.
Chekhov's gun.
Yeah, Chekhov's gun. Yeah, that does not seem to be what's happening here unless you look at the movie in a certain way. And because the very opening scene is the dollhouse, right? The camera's moving in on the dollhouse, and the dollhouse becomes a scene in the movie, and the door opens and you realize you're looking at an actual set and there's actual humans and people in it. And to me, when I watched that movie, I was like, okay, this entire movie is going to be just either a Shyamalan setup where like the end is like totally revealing that it's not reality, or like I thought the whole time that the realness of certain scenes or the story or things that happen in it would be much more at play in it, and it's kind of not.
Right.
Like not in the way that you would think it is. And we can talk about like in the ways that it kind of is later, but it definitely, the whole idea of playing with reality in the way I expected it with like here's a set, here's not a set. It's, what are you looking at? Like that wasn't a thing in this film.
No, I mean, when you approach a film like this, especially one that you take to be a horror film, if you're invested in horror and know the rules, you kind of have a question. Is this real or not? Is this a Jacob's Ladder scenario or not? Is this all in this person's head or not? What's really happening?
Right.
And it is interesting that it really sets you up for thinking that she's going crazy. Toni Collette is coming unraveled, and this is all in her head, or she's causing it all, and we're just not seeing the scenes of her enacting it all. But no, everything you see is actually straight up like exactly what's happening. It's a demon, which I love. Like if there's a twist, it's that there's not a twist. It's pretty much what you see is what you get.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that's like kind of funny is like Black Swan. Is there a demon swan? Who knows?
Right.
You know, is that even that interesting? Not really. It's like the whole what you're seeing is what's so cool, and that's happening in this a little bit as well. Except for it's almost like we were talking off mic about like normcore stuff. It's like there's like a normcore family drama going on. Like the type of movie that you might not even be able to make anymore, like an Ordinary People movie, like just a bunch of people stressed and yelling at each other. Like there's nobody in spandex throwing a shield, so fuck that movie now. Like that you can't make it
There's
anymore.
no Kramer versus Kramer anymore.
Exactly. That's the movie I was trying to think of earlier. It's so funny that you brought that up. I was trying to think of just like a good example of a real like drama, and like sort of like thing you'd associate with like the early '80s. Like you know, it comes on at 7 and then Dallas is on at 9, like that kind of movie. And then it becomes a nightmare near the end. That's what the director refers to it as, a family drama that becomes a nightmare. And so much horror now is just only the nightmare. Like The Conjuring, for instance. Like it kicks off with haunted shit. Haunted shit happens the whole time and it goes off. And in this movie, there's an original cut of it. It's like over 3 hours long. And almost everything that was cut, it's something like 35 individual scenes of family drama. So this film could have been way slower, way more. I mean, the word that popped in my mind is boring, so I'm going to say boring.
Right.
But that's not quite right, like, because the film's not boring.
I think I would be game for a 3-hour version of this film.
I would too, because I think like probably what makes this great is Toni Collette's acting and Gabriel Byrne's like flat dad, like, should I take care of my son or worry about you? And like the whole idea of like, you know, if you're a man married to a crazy person or dating a crazy person, you know that person's crazy and there's no fucking saving them, you know? And so maybe you need to concentrate on
It's
your
all
kid a
management.
little bit. Yeah. At that point, you're just trying to save offspring. But yeah, like that whole playing with like, even her insanity, it's never like she's disassociated and doesn't know what's going on, except for in the sleepwalking stuff, which is just clearly her sleepwalking. It's never like they never even blur the line between dream and reality. It's just like when shit starts going off, it's actually going off in the film, and there's never any point where you wonder like, is it happening? But what is happening is the question of, is the cult hypersane? And bringing us back to our hypersanity thing is like, there's all these things that have they arranged them in this very like Heath Ledger's Joker way to happen. Right. And okay, so that's pretty unusual, or is it just supernatural shit? Because like you pretty much, like once you've gotten to the end of the movie, like I didn't see this movie twice because it's still in the theater and I just didn't make time to do it. But I did watch a lot of shit, as much as you could watch online to see. And it's interesting how like most people say that when you go back to watch this movie again, it's kind of a different experience in the way that when you watch Fight Club for the second time and Marla Singer goes from being like this girl who's just kind of zany to being like a really tragic character. And it seems like everything changes knowing that it's actually all supernatural. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. I think that up against all of that for me, a big component was the hype going into this. And I tend to really be annoyed by film hype because I just want the thing. I don't watch previews. But I was forced to watch previews for this because it was before every single movie I saw in the theater for quite a while. Well, one thing that I think was really interesting, just as a side note, it was being promoted as the scariest film since The Exorcist.
That's how every movie is positioned.
Right.
Like every single movie since The Exorcist has been the scariest movie since The Exorcist.
Totally. But what this movie is ironically the offspring of Rosemary's Baby, not The Exorcist. But in this Me Too moment, you can't say the scariest movie since Rosemary's Baby because of who directed Rosemary's Baby.
Oh, it's so funny. Like, Roman Polanski does not pop into my mind ever when I think about Rosemary's Baby, because it's such a well, for two reasons. One, I saw Rosemary's Baby before I was even aware of, like, this sounds weird, but
Directors?
aware of directors, like
Sure.
not just directors. Like, I mean, it probably wasn't until like the late 90s that I ever even thought about who was directing something. And then my only concern was, is this a Kevin Smith movie? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't interact with film on that level. Like, to me, it was very much about like the experience of seeing it with my friends in the theater. And I always remembered almost like more autobiographically my feeling about, like, towards the movie than who made it. And then it was actually through Kevin Smith, and he would talk about other directors. I started paying attention to directors, and I worked in a movie theater. But I mean, I don't know. Like, do you think it matters that Roman Polanski directed Rosemary's Baby?
I think it does. I mean,
Yeah.
but it does to me, because I'm the type of person who actively, like, I can't conscionably give money to a movie that Tom Cruise is in. Like, I'll watch it, but I'm not going to pay for it.
Not even The Last Samurai?
What's that?
I'm just kidding.
Anyway, back to the point, like, the scariest movie since The Exorcist is actually, I think, not what they wanted to say. It was just hookier. Because it's not that much like The Exorcist, actually, really. But it made for a good ad campaign where you think that Millie Shapiro is possibly the kind of protagonist. Obviously, it's going to be Toni Collette, but it sort of sets up Millie Shapiro as being the, like, main horror of this movie. It's going to be a scary kid movie.
Yeah.
And it totally isn't. They pull a Hitchcock and offer pretty early in the film.
It sort of is, because I think that Millie is possessed for most of this film.
I just mean she's not in the whole film.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Like, she's gone, like, in the scheme of things pretty early.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's suddenly, nope, it turns out it's not about her. It's about something else.
I was very surprised. Like, her death in the film, I was very surprised by it.
Amazing.
The foreshadowing of it was really interesting. Like, when they drive by and there's the Payman symbol
Yep.
on the pole, and you're
Yep.
like, okay, this is going to be something. And, you know, and then she comes back and that takes her head off, you
Yep.
know? And, like, it opens up questions of, like, free will almost. Like, you know, how much,
Totally.
yeah, like, how much did they know?
I totally want to get into free will and determinism, but first, still talking about hype.
Yeah.
I think that of course sets up expectations, and I think that this film had so many expectations placed on it because of all the hype. And it reminds me of how we've often noted that our episode about the Neon Demon is our most listened to episode. Still? Is it still?
Yeah. It's
And
like way out in front.
that's amazing. And our assumption is that that's because that's the type of movie that wants explainers.
Yeah.
Like, people just kind of want someone to talk about it to them because it's not a linear, obvious film. And I think that I've noticed there's a lot of explainer videos about Hereditary out there.
Yeah, there's
and I
a
think
ton.
it's similar because it doesn't follow traditional structure, and that leaves a lot of people probably very much hanging. But it really makes me ask a question about so I listen to a lot of, like, how did this get made, and pop cultural criticism, and a lot of cracked.com articles and podcasts and things like that. And they so often talk about 3-act structure and a film's success or failure based on its adherence to the rules, and this belief in that there are rules about why films do work or don't work. And it really makes me wonder about those rules being descriptive or prescriptive. I've brought this up on a previous episode, but I think it's really interesting because we don't talk about that with music, say. Like, if some rock band suddenly came out with an album that sounded absolutely nothing like their previous album, people would raise questions, obviously, but people don't sort of approach music as, well, there are rules. Most people, I would say. There's just, like, music I like and music I don't like. But with cinema, well, the main character has to do this thing by a certain point, and it didn't, and that's why I didn't like it when it comes to film criticism.
Sure.
Do you agree with that?
I think I disagree with it, and I think it's because I'm misunderstanding you a little bit. And so I'm going to ask a clarifying question. It's like, well, what about pop music?
Pop music is very formulaic, but if Kanye West did something wholly abstract, people wouldn't say, well, that's a failure because the chorus didn't kick in until the very end of the song. They would go, he's a genius. The chorus didn't kick in until the very end of the song. Whereas in a movie, if Toni Collette died 30 minutes in, this movie would be an absolute failure because people would not allow for that much of a disruption to the rules of cinema, right? If this movie spent, say, 10 minutes of just films of shots of trees, nobody would accept that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Partly because they'd be bored, but I think mainly because that's not what a movie's supposed to be. I need a movie to do certain things to keep my interest at a certain pace.
Yeah, and I think I'm getting dragged down. Like I don't want to be like argumentative about a really minor point, but I think where I'm sticking is I'm just thinking of that Marilyn Manson quote about how you should never make a song that confuses a stripper.
Right.
Like because the beat's the beat, and you want it to be like that standard 4/4 like crotch dancing, tempo or whatever. And I think that I think music has that or doesn't have that, but I would say that like when music is further away from that, it requires like some sort of personal intervention to enjoy it. Like either you have to have been trained in it or like you're interested in it, but for whatever reason, beyond just enjoying like dance music or something you could dance to like pop wise. So I think I agree with you, but I don't know. I think I'm just getting caught up in the music metaphor maybe a little bit.
I think that people are generally more accepting of, let's say, weirder music than they are accepting of weirder cinema.
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. I remember I was...
Like a teenage kid who's into pop isn't necessarily going to have incredibly diverse tastes.
Yeah.
But structuralist cinema is not popular with anybody
at all.
The way that, let's say, post-techno is with plenty of people, maybe not my parents, but that's not the point. The point is we all sort of unconsciously agree on what the rules of a good movie constitute. We disagree about what are the good movies, but all the movies that we pretty much say are good movies have exactly the same devices and the exact same pacing, and they're all about the same length, and the characters all behave in almost the exact same way. It's like between prescriptive and descriptive, it's like we all have this unconscious prescriptive thing going on when we go to the cinema.
Yeah. Do you think that has something to do with like the amount of attention that you have to pay to a film? Like for instance, you could put on some sort of like crazy 7/13 time signature, weird jazz music with like backwards masked vocals or something, and then it could just be on and you're not occupied with it in the same way of film. So it's like it doesn't need to entertain you. It can just be on. Like music can just be on, creating atmosphere. Like I can listen to like the kind of music you make, which is just atmospheric or
just boring.
Well, but what my point is like it doesn't need to be boring or not boring.
Right.
It can be. It's doing a different job. Whereas film, you're an audience. You sit down in front of a thing,
right,
and you're fed it. And if it doesn't make sense, it's your mind wanders, and all of a sudden you're missing shit on the screen.
Right, but I would say that it's okay for your mind to wander. And again, I feel like there is this prescription that you need to be fully engaged in cinema, or else this capitalist mechanism is failing to do its job by keeping you fully engaged / distracted. And I know it's very cynical, but I sort of feel like that's what Hollywood does.
Yeah. But you also wouldn't just, I guess some people do put movies on in the background or whatever, but it reminds me of a couple weeks ago, I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and the whole thing, it's unbelievable. It's so immersive and cool. Like you're just wandering through an area that looks like a blown out town outside of Bastogne, and it feels like, and then the temperature's cooler and you're really cool. But then there's there's movies playing, and they're all movies, like they're like 40-minute little loops and stuff like that. But no one would go in and sit down and watch the movie beginning to end.
Right.
They're just playing, and you're moving through like I guess life and history in this museum exhibit. Like I wonder if you could even do something like that with horror films, where you had just like almost like I guess it's sort of like a haunted house at that point. You're just like walking through, experiencing these pieces of these films, but you're still reminded of other things, like horns in a song sound triumphant or whatever, whereas in film, things on screen have symbol, they mean things. I don't know. I feel confused now.
Sorry. Can we talk about feminism then?
Ugh.
Good. I'm glad you're as excited as I am. I think one thing that was really interesting about this movie, and I didn't see many people necessarily like bringing this up in this way, is that horror continues to be seemingly the only genre of film that allows women to have protagonist roles still, and this is an example, of course.
She deserves the Oscar, I think. I haven't seen any other performance that stands up to this.
Yeah. And although I found there are 2 scenes that are basically her coming unraveled, and they go on way too long. Mm-hmm. And they kind of get weird again. Like, I found myself kind of getting a little bored with the scene taking too long, but it was a little bit like Shelley Duvall swinging the baseball bat in The Shining, where it's just like so repetitive and so boring that it gets fucked up again because it goes on too long. Sort of like a joke that if you say it twice, it's like, ha ha ha. Third time, it's not funny. 10 times, it starts to kind of get funny again.
It's like a Tim and Eric skit.
Right. Yeah. What I appreciated about how this movie worked in terms of gender is that even though it's about Toni Collette, and you sort of think that Millie's character, the daughter, might be the sort of like the demon or the sub and the sort of antagonist, and even though it's past this curse or whatever we feel at first is passed from the grandmother, the mother who it's her funeral at the very beginning of the movie. It's a masculine demon that is, and the dad, Gabriel Byrne, he almost is not in this movie. If there was the 3-hour version, that might be very different. But he is so deferential and so useless. And the son is just a stoner. He has no character. I think he's a really good actor. I just mean the character is just like some kid, doesn't seem really into anything. Mom's an artist. Daughter is an artist. He's just some guy. And hang on.
Yeah, I was I'll interrupt with there just to see if this there's a lot of set exposition of him being a musician. Like, there's a gang of music equipment and keyboards and like not the type of shit that like a child would have laying around.
Yeah, he's an upper middle class suburban kid.
I still think it's totally unwalked out, but I think there's just enough there of his being an artist, and his being an artist plays into a point I want to make later, but I don't want to derail you.
Oh no, I was just thinking that the father and son are sort of empty, and the son is an empty vessel. But they're not chosen. The women are not chosen in this film. The boy is, and I think that this sort of demonstrates the lie of patriarchy. That this is not a meritocracy. That the demon could not inhabit a female body, despite the fact that these are vibrant people. The demon had to choose this boy who's kind of the least interesting part of this family. Why? Because. Well,
there's some things to say about that there.
Say them.
Yeah. So I would say that this is actually a movie about matriarchy rather than patriarchy. Like, because the mother, my family dynamic is a bit like this movie. So it was kind of fun seeing this movie with my mom. Is like there was a tyrannical, borderline evil grandmother in the family, and so I'm watching this movie with my mom, and my mom is pretty crazy, and and there's definitely some things in my life and my personality that have definitely been inherited from these 2 insane women. And it's like when you grow up in a house full of just batshit crazy women, it doesn't leave a lot of room for you, really. So like I sort of like understood why this character is just reclusive in his room, kind of hanging out, trying to find a girlfriend or whatever. His character made a lot of sense to me because I was like, oh, this is kind of how I was, like,
sure.
Doing anything to get out of the house basically at any time and just trying to wait it out until you went to college or whatever. I felt like just from my own personal experience, that character rang true for me a little bit.
Sure.
Kind of a lot. But I think that like the whole idea of the demon not being able to inhabit a female body, I think that comes straight from the mythology of this actual demon in the real world, in that like with that sort of like high magic, Like if you look in like Crowley stuff and older stuff, there's high priestesses and high priests, and they perform as the male and female gods. And I think that, like, for sure that's probably patriarchy at play in paganism or whatever, but I don't think it's like off the shelf college patriarchy criticism. You know what I mean? It's much older. It's like this god or this demon king is male, so it needs to go into a male body. Like I don't think the princes of hell have gotten the memo about third wave gender theory. You know what I mean? Like I think it's
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like one of those things, you know. I think it's like, yeah, you could make that criticism, but I think that, like, the Prince of Hell goes into a male body. In that respect, I guess Exorcist was a little bit more feminist.
I would say I would venture to guess that most possession films are possessing a female body, which has its own, depending on the film, its own sort of like, then it becomes about patriarchal control very easily, whether intentional by the filmmakers or not. But this film, that's not quite what I'm talking about. I'm more talking about like meritocracy being the sort of like lie perpetrated by patriarchy, and this film is a sort of, it can be read in some sort of lit crit way as being an exposure of that lie.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I
you
think
don't have to agree. I'm just...
Well, I think just in the title of the film, Hereditary, right? Like, we're talking about family lines here. And the way I was thinking about this film is like, yeah, individuals are possessed, but really the family is possessed. Yes. Like the entire family is possessed. And to a certain extent, like probably this cult of weirdos that are in the film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's also worth observing that arguably the best horror movies of the last many years have all been family based. Mm-hmm. The Babadook, The Witch, A Quiet Place. Well, it's not that great, but
yeah, I mean,
it's solid and it's a family. Yeah. That's a really ripe place to talk about really dark subject matter. But
Krampus.
Yeah.
I mean, I
love that movie.
Yeah. I mean, like,
I'm really excited for it to be Christmas so we can finally cover that. Wait, did we cover it already?
We did cover it. Yeah. We did.
I bet it was Christmas. Great. I don't remember.
It was the best episode we've ever done.
Jesus, Mark. But getting back to free will and determinism, I think that is also ripe because so much about free will and determinism, I really feel like, is on the table right now culturally, because as we expand dialogue about, say, mental illness and not blame the subject, or addiction and not blame the addict.
Wait, are we not supposed to blame them?
No, we're not.
No, I don't know about that, but
you don't have to agree. I'm just saying that this is sort of how we're addressing things like illness and poverty and addiction.
Totally.
And is that they're social ills and that they're structural. So of course that's how this movie operates, right? Is because it's a family curse.
Right.
They're trapped. But it is fun watching this movie a second time, or thinking about it in retrospect, that there are all these moves and counter moves. Like, what does Toni Collette do? What does the daughter do? What does the son do? And none of it matters. And it's not clear whether, and this brings up progressive entrapment, that expression I stole from the movie Witchboard.
You should probably explain that here in case somebody didn't hear the last episode.
Witchboard, a not very good movie from the 80s about Ouija boards, has this great expression describing what happens with demonic possession, describing it as progressive entrapment. It's a good tactic to use in a horror film. So instead of the plot being the demon came and killed you, or the demon came and possessed you and the movie's over, progressive entrapment, it's sort of like you build the narrative on how this demon slowly is able to consume your soul, your body, your family, whatever. And that's obviously at play here. Paimon doesn't just suddenly take the son. It's all these moves. And Toni Collette is trying to figure out what's going on and stop it in time. And I love that it's almost so nihilist that there was nothing anybody could have done. Everything you watched in that 2 hours or however long this movie is didn't matter. This was going to happen. You know, the son was going to be Paimon's receptacle.
Yeah, it's like the brother that has killed herself before the movie. Toni Collette's character's brother
Yeah.
has killed himself because he didn't want his mother putting people inside him.
Yes.
And in the movie, you're watching it like, oh, he obviously had schizophrenia. And
Yep.
you realize he's actually super rational.
Yes.
And has taken the only move out of, the only real way of preventing this from happening is to kill herself. And you wonder, like, okay, all these horrible things that she was doing, like pouring turpentine all over her kids and, maybe going to set her children on fire and end the family line. Like, that's actually a protective move.
It's actually pretty rational way to approach this terrible situation.
Yeah, it's the most rational move. It's basically killing baby Hitler. You know what I mean? Like, that's pretty much what she's doing.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, like, where that came from, because, like, her character, I can only imagine that, like, the grandmother would have maybe raised her to be sort of more of a high priestess. Like, why wouldn't she have been more involved in the sort of cult process? Like, it seemed like, okay, the brothers died, unless, like, the mother being, like, totally, like, okay, it's all about the son, just didn't even give a fuck about her. You know what I mean? Because I think she might have been the older sister, so she was born first and basically discarded. And then because of what I think a theory I have is because of the proximity to a cult dedicated to this god of creativity and science, I think it just sort of wears off. And, everybody's creative. Like, even the Lady Joan, she has the floor mat that the mother made. Like, there's all these, like, little arts and crafty things in the house. Like, and a lot of characters are involved in artwork. Like, the mother makes the little houses, obviously. The daughter, Charlie, makes those little figurines and things like that. Like, and apparently in the movie, whenever she's making the doll, that's when Paimon has possessed her. And like, it's something like the director said or something like that. And also when that light moves, there's like that square light.
Yeah.
Whenever it passes over or through a character, that's the demon like possessing them. And it's like kind of interesting to think about, like, everything that happens to Charlie when you think she's like a victim of all this stuff. Like, she, has the choking on the nuts and things like that. There's a really interesting scene where she's eating something and it's crunching. And you're like, wait a minute, she eating nuts?
Right.
Like,
I
is
think
this
that's
whole...
at the funeral.
Yeah.
She's eating a chocolate bar. And,
yeah, she's
and
eating...
Mom says, does that have nuts in it?
Yeah, and it's like, but it's like crunching, and you're like, okay, like maybe it does. Like, and so like then the nut thing later on, like there's a lot of like really bold but not so obvious foreshadowing. Like when the right before she eats the nut cake and dies, there's this gigantic shot of
a pile of peanuts.
pile of nuts, and then later on they make a whole big deal about the outside light going on and off. Like, it's really like, okay, why are you making a big deal out of there being a motion sensor light on the outside? But later on in the movie, when shit's going off the rails, the motion sensor light goes on and you can see the mom kind of hanging. Like that's kind of why you see it. And it's like, oh, that's because the cult's moving around outside the house. And like there's all these weird little things that like the scenery and the set design in this movie, I'm surprised more people aren't talking about it. Like, people are arguing over like, what does the demon do? Or like all this weird like stuff, but they're not as many people talk about the set design.
I mean, it's an obvious thing to love, but it's sort of a Wes Anderson thing, but the dollhouse into the house, not only just the shot that establishes that, but I think it really sets up the gaze, the viewer, going back to free will and determinism, that if you look at this dollhouse, we can sort of think of this is Toni Collette's character's art because consciously or unconsciously it gives her an ability to control her domestic situation by making it to her will. Unfortunately, it's usually a recreation of the most awful moments of her life, but giving us the perspective of this movie through that dollhouse, it's sort of like we've got the demon's view. We are observing from the outside that this is all predetermined.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things I think about whenever there's a demon in a movie, it always kind of makes me think like, okay, well, theologically speaking, if there's a demon, there should be some sort of divinity or something like that. In this movie, we've talked about Catholic horror in the past. I feel like this is like a Gnostic horror movie.
Yeah.
Because the demon is never really like, what's the demon of? Art and science. Is that bad? I don't know. You know,
what are you going to fight it with?
Yeah.
Running out the door quickly. Like there's no priest to call.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's all about like summing the thing, and the only real recourse is to like not participate in it, and by not participating in it, it just sort of slowly drives you insane or something like that. Which is another point I want to make is this is also kind of like a secret Lovecraftian movie, right? Because in Lovecraft, the character goes insane when they're faced with the supernatural, and that's literally what you're watching is a woman who is driven insane by supernatural processes.
At the same time, the son, to whom the greatest tragedy is befalling, there's an amazing scene where he's in the classroom and they're discussing the protagonist in some book, and I'm forgetting, but the teacher's talking about fate. Mm-hmm. And that's the son is just completely tuning out. He's not even paying attention to a conversation in the classroom about what is happening to him.
Yeah, and he looks in the mirror, or he looks in the reflection, and the reflection has a slightly different expression on its face. I mean, it's definitely cool. You feel like he's like losing control because he's like actually losing control.
Totally.
Speaking of losing control, I want to talk a little bit more about like the scene where Charlie dies. Like,
hell yeah,
it's a great. I mean, it's a shock because, you know, we talked about a little while ago about like, oh, you know, movies just don't kill kids. That is done. Like movies kill kids now. Like that's like we mentioned it like it was amazing a few episodes ago, and like that some movie did it, and like it's not even a thing to talk about anymore. But what's even better is like when they find her head later and it's just covered in ants and it's just that big stuff. It's such a good shot, like because you're like, oh, this happened. It's not like a dreamscape thing. It totally like because he kind of the brother stumbles in the house kind of weird, and you're like, okay, did something happen? Like, how fucked up is she? And you're like, imagine like you walk out your house and your car is there, and your son has borrowed it, and now your headless daughter is in the back seat, and he just didn't tell you. I mean, that's fucked up.
Oh, totally. I read that they shot in graphic detail the decapitation of Charlie, and I think them leaving it out made it more brutal.
Oh, it's like what you would say about every classic horror movie, that no one ever seems to learn that lesson.
Yeah.
But they learned it here. You know, I mean, because you're like, it happens so suddenly and it's so jarring. You don't know what has even happened.
Yes.
But I think it's pretty a fresh idea to not show you the action, but then you see the aftermath, which is kind of like how we experience crime in the world.
True.
You know what I mean? Like no one sees it unless you watch a video or whatever or something, but like you see, like you always see the victim. You don't really see the act so much. In this, you know, and then it's the whole headless thing. Like every time somebody loses a head in this movie, it's like a big scene stealer. You know? Yeah, totally. You know what's interesting, like biographical about that girl? She has the same condition that the little boy from Stranger Things has, the kid that's missing the teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. At first I was like, are they related? I was like, is that his sister? And then I was like, oh no, they just have the same super rare condition. It's interesting that like two horror movies within the same year.
Right.
Well, I'll call Scary Thoughts or Stranger Things a horror movie.
Sure.
Like two of them have actors with this like crazy rare disease and child roles. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's weird. Like a strange coincidence.
Yeah.
Like, you know, is there like a whole bunch of kids out there with that same condition now?
They're all auditioning.
They're all ready for movies.
So you sent an article to me that was about like intertextuality and the exhaustion of that.
I would not find this film to be very intertextual. Did you?
Well, it is. No. Okay. Not intertextual, but that it draws from all these, like, it's a little bit, don't look now. It's a little bit.
Oh, I remember the article now. Yeah. It was talking about, the article talked about how these things that we think are really great are just very careful assemblies of things that are great. But that's kind of always been...
It's always been true, and that's every episode we've done about horror movies.
Yeah, and it's
since episode 1.
And I'm really meaning to get around to reading Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence, because I think he will have a lot of answers to this. Because I've read synopsises of it, and I want to read it eventually this year. But his whole thing is like, you can't help but copy.
Yeah,
like it's just impossible not to, and that the real artist will feel anxiety about the copying. Right. Like, because they're aware of both that it's happening and that they're unable to not do it. So that's why, like, you read, like, when you read Cormac McCarthy in a vacuum, you read, like Blood Meridian, you're like, holy fuck, I don't even know how a human could have written this book. It's so incredible. And then you go read a book about that book, like Books Are Made of Other Books, which is the book about it. You're like, oh, this is a real story that it's based on, and it's just super obscure. And Cormac McCarthy is lifting lines completely out of like the Old Testament and Melville and other books of the same time. You're like, okay, he's actually assembled this thing that is incredible, and it's greater than its parts. I think for it to be a real work of art, though, like if that assembly is happening in all forms of art, then it sort of is this idea that the true art is true assembly, like having taste to put these things together and arrange them in a certain way that is pleasing is really what's happening with all art, especially film, because it's so collaborative.
Right. But I think the way that is all playing out in texts now is that because we live in this intertextual, hyper-ironic world, there's this layer of they know that I know that they know that I know that they know.
Yeah.
So dropping references to previous horror films in a horror film, whether it's lampshaded or covert or it's an Easter egg. If you pause it at the right point, it's all about this sort of like wink and a nod, which is fine. But as we've said before, it mostly makes for interesting YouTube dissection videos once it comes out on streaming that people can bite all the still images from it.
I mean, you could look at this movie and be like, okay, this is definitely like, this reminds me of Carrie, this reminds me of The Shining, this reminds me of whatever. And it's kind of funny that like we're all living in this Stephen King world now. Yeah. It just came from behind.
We all live in Castle Rock.
Yeah. I mean, I've been meaning to watch Castle Rock too. I haven't heard anything about it. I want to watch it. But, it's one of those things that's so interesting. Like I was thinking about Meg Ellison when I've been thinking about all this Stephen Kingification, is like how right she was to be like, that's the person I'm going to study. It's interesting. And then when you read her books, there's a lot of The Stand in there. It has to be. It's a 1,200 page apocalyptic novel. She has an apocalyptic novel, but I think she's done herself and her career a real service. She's so smart. Who knows? It was probably partially on purpose, but like who could tell that like when you're reading all this shit in the 90s, you're gonna have a career with it in the 20 teens. Right. But yeah, like being immersed in like the type of thing that Stephen King does seems to be a little bit like what horror is going in right now. And then there's definitely a lot of The Shining in this movie. But what else? Like, there's definitely some Hitchcock stuff. And there's even like some Shyamalan stuff, I think, with like the hanging from the ceiling and the weird.
Well, it definitely reminds me a lot of Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, which is great. It draws, I mean, from Astor's own mouth, it draws a lot from Japanese ghost tales, cinema. A little bit of Changeling. It's hard for me not to also be reminded of Amityville Dollhouse, which is a terrible movie, but
is there a movie
Dollhouse?
There a movie about an Amityville Dollhouse?
Yes, wow. Yes. Yeah, whatever's in your head, it's probably better than the actual movie.
Yeah, it's weird.
Something I really appreciated about this movie. I mean, I was saying earlier that it was almost nihilist. I feel like it's unapologetically cruel in a way that few films are, and that includes this sort of latest wave of most horror films. I find that most horror films end on a slightly up note, like the final girl survives, let's say, or there's redemption or something like, say, The Exorcist, or it ends as a tragedy, but it's kind of a fun jump scare ending, like the end ? And that's not really tragedy. That's just like, yeah, it was scary and it's still scary out there, but that's not genuinely tragic. This movie is unapologetically just brutal. Yeah. It's not an ironic it ain't over ending. Yeah. And it's definitely not a a happy ending. It's just brutal and everybody dies and it's horrifying and it's awful and there's no way out.
Yeah, even McCarthy's The Road has a happier ending than this.
Right, which is like sit on that for a moment.
Yeah, like the bleakest novel ever written has a happy ending, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. Like
oh, I'm sorry, and it's not moralizing. Like some tragic
Yes.
horror movies, it ends tragically to sort of make a point about something.
Mm-hmm.
There's no moral here. It's just awful.
yeah, because you wonder, like, okay, you've summoned a king of hell.
Yeah.
Clearly, things are going to be bad.
Yeah.
You know, like, because that's not a thing that's supposed to happen.
I would love to know what kind of test audience situation this movie had, because I would venture to guess that the reason why this is the case with most movies of a certain budget is because of test audiences. Like, it's got to have a happy ending, because test audiences will always drive for that and have changed many films to have a happy ending that shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Or some sort of satisfying tragic ending. Again, irony, it's not over and that's exhilarating. But it's hard to think of films that have a high budget that are just brutal and tragic at the end. And I think that's Rosemary's Baby and The Shining are amazing examples of that. I don't know if test audiences really existed to any capacity back then, but those movies are unrepentantly just brutal at the end. And I can't imagine a test audience would have given those a thumbs up.
Yeah, even Schindler's List sort of has a happy ending.
Does it?
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'll
like,
never know.
yeah, you'll never know. That movie's great. But yeah, like, there's like a thing that, like, at the very end, like Schindler's List, which is a heavy, heavy movie, you know, at the very end, there's a scene where, like, the people who have survived come and put, like, flowers on Oscar Schindler's grave or something like that. So you're like, oh, okay, all this brutality had a redemption near the end of it. So there's like no redemptive arc, which is sort of why I think it's like a no-stick movie rather than like a, you know, a normal, like, Christian horror movie.
Yeah, there's no moral.
Yeah, like, there's really, like, there is no savior position. There's no, you know, divinity or anything like that. And then in the tradition of ceremonial magic, you would be able to summon this particular demon. And there's actually, if you go on YouTube, there are people who do worship this character. You know, like, it's a
Really?
known, yeah, and they're all, you know, they're goofballs. They're like, it's like, to me, it's like, okay, you've gone to the trouble of getting rid of your native religion and you've adopted this absolutely fucking retarded thing, you know, that is clearly not real. But I wonder if, like, people will, if this movie will sort of create like a bit of like a Paimon renaissance. Like, people will be like, oh, I'm going to worship this demon and learn about math and science. And, you know, you summon Neil deGrasse Tyson into your house at night. That's the whole thing. When they said he was the demon of art and science, I just immediately wanted a movie where Neil deGrasse Tyson plays the devil. I was like, that would be hilarious.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about the score. We haven't talked about scores in a while.
Colin Stetson, the saxophonist.
Yeah, for the Arcade Fire and Tom Waits. Like, I went and listened to some of his music. It's very orchestral, you know, film score type stuff.
Yeah. I thought the score was great. It totally worked. I think we're in a place right now where horror soundtracks are increasingly leaning towards either the sort of like John Carpenter and sometimes Goblin model of arpeggiation and synthesizers, like Stranger Things is a really obvious example, or it's continuing down the, again, Blumhouse, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the composer for most of those films. It was actually really interesting, but sort of discordant screeching, bows against metal. This movie, I thought, did an interesting job of not really falling into either of those and still being able to create tension. Although there, you know, it does rely on a lot of techniques that have been mined and cultivated and weaponized over the years, which is, if you play a tone low enough so it's kind of imperceptible, if you're in a movie theater and it's shaking your ass, it's just totally uncomfortable.
Yeah, they did some interesting experimental stuff with the sound design in this movie. Like the little girl's like that noise she makes. It pans around the theater.
Oh yeah, heavily.
And you're like, whoa, this is cool.
Yeah, there were twice. Even the second time I saw this movie and should have seen it coming, I thought it was someone behind me being an asshole because it was panned so hard and to the left.
Yeah,
one of the times where she's not doing it on camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a little.
And
upsetting.
there's a bunch of sounds like that. Like there's this like kind of like boop, 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 boop sound that happens in certain parts. And the director says that like, and there's a Q&A I watched with him, and they talked about how somebody gave them notes and wanted that noise out. And it's actually part of the score. It's not sound design. It's like it's a clarinet noise.
Oh, far
like
out.
a bass clarinet or something like that. He's made this noise, and they're like, well, it's not sound, and that was how they kept it, I guess, was like, it's not sound design, it's actually in the music. And they're like, oh, okay. But it gives it's almost like in trailers that like the wong. It's like a new noise that'll, I'm sure we'll probably see it in other movies coming up because it's so unsettling and cool.
Yeah. That's great.
I didn't know where this movie took place when I watched it. Like, I actually went and looked it up. I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, because the house, it's sort of out in the trees. It made me think a little bit like it would be in New England or something like that. But it's like in Utah, right? I think it's like outside Salt Lake or something like that, which is kind of, gives this movie a little bit of, even though it's not East Coast, it gives it a little bit of like that thing that Get Out has, which is like really crazy shit happens around rich people. And especially when their houses are sort of isolated from other people's houses.
Right.
It's almost like this like insularity of success allows crazy demonic shit to happen.
Interesting you should bring up isolation because Monique, my wife, and I got into a discussion where she was saying that horror takes place in isolation, and which comes back to a conversation you and I have often had about it's easier to have horror films be retro because then you don't have cell phones and communication technology, so people are genuinely isolated and unable to do basic things that would help them survive. But in this, it's usually like, my phone is dead, but in this film, it's like family miscommunication and alienation from each other, that the dysfunction of the family is actually what is part of the isolation horror in this movie. Thanks, Monique. I have a question for you. Do you think that horror and thrillers in general age out sort of like comedy ages out? Comedy is so often very much of its moment, and it gets pretty stale pretty quickly. And horror often relies so much on techniques that we get, like certain sound effects cues and things like that we were just discussing, get stale and get not scary anymore. That doesn't mean comedies at some point are not funny anymore and horror films stop being scary. But do you think they maybe sort of age out similarly in a way that other cinema doesn't?
I think they do. And it would be hard for me to even say, like, does all film age out like that? Like, for example, the 40th anniversary of Animal House just passed. And I don't know if you watched Animal House recently.
No.
But it's not as funny. And like I remember being like, holy fuck, this is the funniest movie I've ever seen when I watched it like as a little kid.
Right.
Same thing with like Blazing Saddles. And part of it has to do with the style of editing. Like in those old comedies, like those late 70s, early comedies, the camera holds after the punchline for as much as 4 or 5 seconds. So you'd be like, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, hold, next scene. Right. Whereas like now movies cut really fast, and so like even and I'm wondering if those faster cuts will date in the same way because like they're just cutting everything like I don't think having action interesting all the time will wear as badly as those weird long stale cuts. And I think like I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just the difference between an all-time classic and not, is like they just hit the exact amount of time scenes need to last and the exact amount of dialogue that needs to be in them. And like, but I mean, have you watched an old horror movie in a while and been scared by it in any way?
Only outliers like The Shining. Like I've seen that 100 times and somehow, and not just because I don't think I give it some sort of special aura of scary. I love it, but I find it's genuinely upsetting still, even after all these years. But generally speaking, I don't. I sort of think of it like this, and pardon me if this example doesn't work for a lot of people, but if we think of something like techno music,
the worst.
100% disagree. But maybe I'm about to describe the reason why I like it and the reason you don't like it. Techno ages out very quickly, devolves very quickly, and it gets stale very quickly. And people who are very connected to techno culture tend to be very aware of if something is even 4 months old just by hearing it, even if they don't know what it is, because its evolution is so rapid. And part of that is because techno, to my mind, is all about these techniques, these little movements, these little strategic aesthetic movements of technology, of sound synthesis and sampling and things like that, that slowly keep moving in these increments collectively. It's like this global project of this music called techno that everybody just kind of like inches forward, and this other person inches it forward, and this other person discovers something and inches it forward, and it's constantly evolving. But then it ages out very quickly because so much of its affect is about this discovery of this little sound that nobody on the dance floor has heard before. And I feel like comedy and horror films are often very similar, that it's about these little techniques. How do you create tension and release, both with a joke or with a scare? And these techniques get very quickly like adopted, recycled. Someone incrementally shifts it, like, and we've talked about this before, but jump scares, like they still kind of work, but who cares? Right?
Yeah.
Like the arc of a jump scare is in itself so predictable, and there's only so many ways to do a jump scare, and they've been weaponized, and so if it's full throttle all the time, it's ineffective.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's anything, even like if you're just describing progress,
Sure.
because like the way you're describing techno reminds me of just automotive technology. Like you have 4 tires, steering wheel, gas brake, but every year, like even the same manufacturer is making an incremental change that makes everybody crazy. Like you're like, oh fuck, there's cruise control now, or holy shit, like there's a touchscreen nav. Like every advancement but then with enough time that passes, certain cars emerge as being great.
Right. Well, I think it's true of everything. Everything evolves and shifts and changes, and some persevere and some die off. But I think that the difference with like what I'm comparing with techno and comedy and horror film is that because it's so much about affect as opposed to content. So if we talk about maybe dramatic films, they possibly, in the way I'm thinking about it, and if people want to email in at scarythoughts.org, they can argue with me, but decent narrative films tend to rely more on content, let's say story or cinematography, rather than affect. There's some sort of like immediate gratification. It's far less libidinal than these other forms that are constantly pushing for, if you're trying to get a scare, you've always got to change that technique and change that technique.
Yeah.
Action films, like I was saying, horror and thriller, but action films do a similar thing. They age out pretty quickly, where without the gravitas of 2 people fighting over something they believe in, if it's just about the action, well, old fight films are mostly really shitty.
Yeah.
Bruce Lee films aged well because it's easy to get invested in him as a person and a character.
Yeah.
But most vintage fight films are super boring.
Yeah, I think probably like another thing with horror in particular and comedy in particular is they rely on a surprise to get the effect. Horror is like, you laugh because of what's being said is the opposite of what you were thinking, or, horror has to frighten you with something. And then like once you've seen the trick, it's kind of over, and unless the characters are so well developed that you care about what's happening to them, which makes me wonder if Hereditary will survive, or will it sort of go down as like a Sixth Sense sort of movie where you're like, you always remember it as being cool, but after you've seen it once or a couple times, you don't really need to see it again, unless you're like, oh my God, you haven't seen that movie? Let's watch that. I think Hereditary might be a movie that people continue to watch, but I don't know that people will continue to rewatch it. Like Requiem for a Dream, for instance. Like I remember being completely blown away by that movie. And then I watched it again relatively recently after having thought like, oh, fuck, I never need to see this movie again. And you're like, okay, all those weird shortcuts that it makes where it's like they do drugs and then it's a close-up of the eye and then it goes dilated really fast and it cuts to like a car crash to whatever. That doesn't work anymore. It's not as upsetting, but I don't know. I don't know. Like, I don't know that it would be to even begin to answer it, I would have to feel like that there was something like unique about horror, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think, sorry to yammer about The Shining, but part of what is enduring about that as a scary film is that the jump scares are off the music. And oftentimes the music will have jump scare moments in the random middle of a tracking shot that has nothing eventful happening on screen.
Yeah.
So even before these, I was talking earlier about the rules, even before these rules became ever more solidified, it has no interest in those kinds of rules. Like,
yeah, something I appreciated. I noticed that there was like tension built in weird moments of the movie that didn't pay off in a normal way.
Hereditary?
Yeah.
Like what?
Like there's moments where the music will get intense or not intense, it's like sort of doing something different. Like for example, the scene where he wakes up and she's like about to burn him again or something like that. There's no sound at all other than their voices, and you're like, oh, this is like pretty interesting, because like normally there would be like advanced crazy music in the scene making it nuts, and the decision to like take the music away.
The vacuum is uncomfortable.
Yeah, the vacuum is really uncomfortable. So it's like he's using the fact that you're normally looking for some sort of crazy music, and there is crazy music in this movie. Like it's horror music, but that silence is like a new. Like I could totally see, like if I was making a movie, I would probably steal that in some capacity, not the same way, but I would be like, okay, there will be a moment in this film where like total silence is really impressive in a way.
Do you want to go to audience questions?
Yeah, let's take some questions.
So the first one, this is from Jim Winters. What do you think were the biggest scares of the film?
For me, when the mom saws her head off, it's just so graphic and crazy. I'm like, that was a great scare. The head coming off, obviously, great scare. Yeah. And I think the real subtle things during the seances are great.
Yeah.
I think like actually probably is big. Like I mentioned like the big scares, but I think the creepiness of the seances, especially when it's still just the glasses moving, that is the scariest shit in the movie.
Yeah. I think for me, it took me seeing it a second time to realize that Toni Collette crawling on the wall, and you don't realize it until the scene goes on a while. She's almost in total darkness. She doesn't jump out, and you expect her to. Right after that is her banging her head on the ceiling, trying to get up into the attic really aggressively. And then moments later is her cutting her head off with that wire. Those three things happen very close together.
Yeah, the end of this movie is like balls out.
It really is. And it also, those three moments are very much tied to physical movement and choreography. I'm sure there is CGI involved somehow, but those aren't CGI moments. Those are physicality moments. Her clinging to the wall, her banging her head against the ceiling faster than humanly possible, and her cutting off her head in this contorted way. So those are about like a physicality that I think is grotesque.
Yeah.
And a sort of, it's not body horror, but it's physical horror.
Yeah.
And I think we miss out so much of that when there's just like a CGI spooky skull face that suddenly darts out of the darkness,
Yeah. The thing that's creepy about like up until she cuts her head off, and that's obviously impossible to do, you could maybe get up on that ceiling like that. You know what I mean? So you're like, so it's a little bit of like, does she have like crazy strength, and she was able to like climb up the wall and like be, and then when she starts banging her head, she's hanging upside down. Obviously that's not a thing that anybody but like a ninja warrior could do.
Right.
But that last sequence, it just ratchets it up so fast.
Yeah.
Another super creepy thing is the old man at the funeral that's smiling, and then later he's just balls out, butt naked, smiling in the closet. I mean, because it's the same smile. It's so creepy and so weird.
That was upsetting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, like even just the way that the king figure is in the doll in the treehouse. Later, just the set blocking of the treehouse, or that the treehouse is suddenly huge to fit all these people in it, like on the inside. That's totally like, the TARDIS, but scarier.
Yeah.
Like it, like the whole idea of like playing with the size and space of a place. It's very House of Leaves
Oh, totally.
You know, like
Well,
that.
it's also, Shining.
The
again.
Shining. Yeah, again. I
The
mean, it's
impossibility
all
of
The Shining.
Outlook
Yeah.
Hotel. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this movie's just full of like creepy shit.
Like very memorable creepy shit.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that if I only saw this movie once, didn't have a podcast that forced me to think about it, that in 10 years I would still remember quite a lot of just passing moments in this movie because they were genuinely fucked up.
And I feel like I did see the movie just once, and I feel like I did not forget a single thing that was mentioned when I would watch these review podcasts or whatever, or like, 12 things you didn't realize. I was like, no, I realized all that shit.
I was right there.
Yeah, it's really well done.
All right, this question is a little bit long. My biggest issue with the film Hereditary is that I feel like the trailer, the title, and the tagline set me up for a different kind of film than what was delivered. I wanted to be scared and thought the movie was going to be about the sinister family dynamics of 3 generations of women with some sort of supernatural forces at work. The preview was especially disturbing due to the casting of the strange-looking girl as the daughter. I saw a lot of potential for a different kind of psychological horror, one rooted in feminine family tensions. The plot had twists and turns, and although Toni Collette is mesmerizing to watch, I don't think she can be the only thread of continuity in this film. Eventually, what surfaces is a satanic cult movie. I don't mind this, but because it took so long to unravel the mystery, no momentum was built in this direction, and thus no real scares. If it was a Satan movie from the get-go, with visible clues given to the audience, that would have been preferable in my opinion. As it was, the movie moved along with one what the fuck moment after another, until you finally have to say to yourself, oh, that's what this movie is, a rehashed genre film. Question, is my disappointment warranted? Did anyone else see a promise for a different kind of movie with this film?
Well, I would say disappointment is always warranted. Like, just in general. But, yeah, think about even a movie where the shenanigans are supernatural from the jump. You still sort of have to build up to it, like House of the Devil, right? Like, it doesn't just go straight to devilry. Like, there's some other stuff that happens. And in this film, all that stuff is happening, but it's concealed in a family thriller. And then, so I think the question is, like, how shanghaied you felt by the family thriller thing. I just think it's so good. It's hard. Like, I didn't see the trailer until after I watched the movie because I wanted to go into this movie really cold.
I wish I could have had that experience.
One of my favorite things is to read a book that I don't know anything about, or to like see a movie or show and just be complete. And if it's good, otherwise you feel like you wasted your time. But when you discover something that is great that you haven't had any like contact with before, it's pretty fun because you feel like you discovered the thing on your own. Yeah. I mean, I didn't quite have that experience with this because everybody's like, oh, you're going to cover Hereditary? You got to see it. So I knew it was something to be, experienced and grappled with. But like, yeah, I don't know, man. I didn't have that experience. So it'd be hard for me to agree or disagree.
Yeah, sorry, dear Jim. I feel actually very strongly to the contrary. I would much rather my expectations. I don't want to have expectations, and I know I have expectations about everything I do. But when it comes to art, I want my expectations foiled. When I leave the house, for example, and go to a show, I want to see something new. I want something unexpected to happen. All my best moments at a performance of music, at a drag club, at theater, the best moments have all been where I was completely overwhelmed by something that I didn't see coming.
Yeah, Monique has a really great moment in her last show where she's just doing this totally physical, grotesque movement in her like vagina costume, and it's like you don't really realize what it is, and then she's like, "This is how a gay man sees a vagina," and it's like the joke is so unexpected for that moment, and it's fucking hilarious. And then the other thing that's great about that, like, is one of my favorite things I've ever seen. I wish she would like do it again or something so people could see it. It's such a good show. But one of the best things about seeing one of her shows is there's a percentage of the audience that knows her and is in on it. And there's a large percent of the audience that doesn't know her and is in on something they think is happening.
Yes.
And you could tell who her San Francisco drag gay friends are when that happens because everyone starts laughing fucking hard.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the audience is like quiet because they don't quite know what to do with it. And so you have the loudest laughter and the most like thunderous silence happening simultaneously. It's one of my favorite moments in any performance I've ever seen. And I'm not doing justice describing it. It's basically like this really complex vagina joke. But it's great. It's fucking great.
It is great. And I mean, there's also sort of that tension between like, you know, when someone makes a reference or a joke that is sort of an inside joke and the insiders laugh and the outsiders don't laugh. Mm-hmm. But when it's kind of not a reference, it's just sort of culturally specific. Like you have to be part of that culture to understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. And half the audience laughs and the other half of the audience, it's not that they didn't get the reference to that Smith's song.
Yeah.
It's that they're just not in on context.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing... But I also love being that person. You know, I love being in the minority in an audience and just kind of having to keep up. Like you just kind of have to do your best.
Yeah.
But so like I hate previews and I don't want to know. And I think that part of the strength of this film for me is that Millie gets killed off. It's not about her.
Yeah.
You think it's a family drama. It's not. You think that, we're invested in Toni Collette, so she must triumph, right? Nope. That's not what happens at all. In fact, she's not even in the last scene of the movie. Mm-hmm. She's just erased from this movie before its conclusion, before its climax.
Yeah. It's weird, like, having watched the trailer only after I saw the film.
Yeah.
Like, so obviously I know what's happening. I felt like the trailer was obscure. I watched the trailer and was like, man, there's no fucking idea I would have known what was going on. And so like the question is a little interesting to me because I don't know what sort of opinion I would have formed having seen the trailer. But I do know that the trailers are deeply effective to people because, you know, marketing people who have, you know, black magic at their fingertips make them. You know, they're not usually, I guess sometimes they're cut by the editor and the director, but a lot of times like they don't have all the authority. And then I'm thinking about sometimes when, more often than not, you can get hyped by a trailer and the movie's terrible. Like I feel like that happens more than I feel like I've been disappointed in a movie itself because the trailer was just as good as the movie was.
Yeah.
More often than I've been like had the experience that I think this listener is having.
Sure.
But the last trailer, I don't know, like the Thor Ragnarok trailer, I think about a lot. Because I thought I got really hyped up to see that movie, and I hate Marvel movies. I think they just fucking suck.
Yeah.
But when I saw that, I was like, oh man, this movie's gonna be rad because it's so visual. And then that movie is unlike that trailer, but it's weirder than. It's actually the only Marvel movie I really like a lot. Is the one that no one likes, Thor Ragnarok.
Right. Last listener question. Actually, we just skimmed across this earlier. Do you think that the casting of the daughter was in any way exploitative due to her appearance and the fact that no mention of it is ever made?
It just makes me think of my mom when we're leaving. My mom's like, what an ugly little girl. Do you think they made her look like... But like, and you can think like, I think in some ways my mom is like this like totally unfiltered person. And like the thing is, she is a weird looking little girl, but like a lot of little girls are weird looking, you know, like it's like at that age, everyone like kind of looks weird. Like you look at the kid from Stranger Things, he has like missing teeth and a weird shaped head, but in the next season, he's like kind of on his way to being like a little heartthrob, you know, like he looks better. He has teeth and stuff like that. But it's like, I don't know, like it's one of the things I hate about this thing is like, okay, is it exploitive or are we just having different people with different faces on the screen? Like I love weird looking actors. It's one of the reasons why I think 70s film is so good.
Yes.
There's so many scenes where like the waiter comes by and he's like missing a tooth, you know, or there's just like odd people and now everybody has the same like homogenized look. It's like why like modern remakes of horror movies, I think, don't succeed. Of the many reasons why a modern remake of a horror movie wouldn't succeed is that, like, for instance, when you remake Texas Chainsaw Massacre, everyone in the film's hot.
Yeah.
Okay, like that was one of the things that's so great about the first one is like every single person, even the girl who's supposed to be hot, is kind of weird looking.
Yeah.
And so...
Well, and you can identify with them more because they're not far off from you and your friends.
Yeah, and I just think
it's not an unattainable identity.
You know, if you played D&D in the 80s and 90s, there was always at least one odd-looking fucking kid around. I mean, God, I was that kid for a long time, you know? So, I don't know. I just like seeing these people get screen time.
I think it's also a testament to Millie Shapiro as an actor, because she is, God made her that way, but God did not make her that way. That is cinema magic and makeup and a performer who is unafraid to be not, let's say, a traditional cute Hollywood darling and go really far in the other direction with it. Like she took her looks and made them more intense. And I think it's really effective, and I think it's something she's very cognizant of. And I think of it as not that this film exploited her, but that she is a really talented artist who worked with what she had without fear.
Yeah.
I
think this is probably going to be a total misunderstanding of the culture by myself. But like one of the things I've always thought that I appreciated about India and their like whole saint thing is like how sometimes like people have these deformities and they're venerated as, like, oh, you look like Ganesh. And like, it's really just a tumor that's really bad on the face, but it's like, oh, this is a person, their difference is appreciated and sort of like fetishized. And I'm sure that could probably be bad. Like, okay, that person doesn't want to sit in a fucking loincloth and beg money outside of a temple. But at least it's kind of interesting that the culture sort of appreciates that. And I think that like, you think about all the movies that have legit freaks in them, like Freaks. Like Freaks is a perfect example.
Yeah.
I think those movies are better with the real person. It kind of reminds me of this row over Scarlett Johansson not playing this trans man. Are you familiar with that whole thing? Scarlett Johansson
after she was in Ghost in the Shell, she dipped back into that fucking pool again.
Well, so there's this movie that that was basically only greenlit because she was attached to it. It's about a woman becoming a man. So apologies for any sort of stepping on like how that should be described, but like that's basically what happens. So she's playing a trans man, I guess is how it works. And so everybody's like, well, you couldn't find one trans male actor. And for me, I think that, okay, like if we're going to allow for a Black James Bond, which I'm all down for, why can't we have a cisgender woman playing whoever? Like it's all fantasy make-believe. But I feel like having the body that went through the experience would work better in a film. You know what I mean? Like
potentially, yeah.
Potentially, yeah.
But also, I mean, I just recently watched an interview with some of the actors in the show Pose, which is the greatest show ever. Everybody should watch that show. Oh my God. And they were talking about the legacy of Hollywood casting cisgendered people in trans roles. And they were saying quite rightfully, fine, let me play a woman. If, cisgendered women playing trans women is fair game, then let me play a woman. I am an actress, and that's a totally legit question that Hollywood will probably never answer and step up to.
Yeah, I mean, well, what about? Oh no, I was going to say I was going to try and I was thinking about the Rocky Horror Picture Show remake, and I was like, oh, is that a trans woman playing a woman? And I'm like, actually, no, it's a trans woman playing a man playing a drag queen, right? Is that correct? I don't know. It's too complicated.
That's probably just as right as it is wrong.
Yeah, it's complicated, I guess.
And it being complicated means that it is not an example.
But the big argument for having Scarlett Johansson play that role is that movie's not going to get made now. So it's done. So like the idea is like, okay, what if she had done a really great performance and it made people open their hearts and minds to like trans people a little bit more?
That is an argument worth discussing, but at the same time, that entirely relies on this belief that art can't happen unless these very specific rules are adhered to, which is all fucking nonsense. Like, that film didn't get made, so therefore it's proof. But at the same time, I hate to go like the whole system's broken, but it is. It's like, well, we couldn't make it without so-and-so. Well, maybe it shouldn't be made then, don't you think? Don't you think that a system of art creation that depends on these really fucked up political strategies is like a broken system?
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole idea of should, shouldn't, I usually don't. I mean, I know you're the same way. You're like, there are no shoulds, there are no shouldn'ts. Like in a way. But I think that that's the thing with film that makes film so one of the reasons why I would probably never want to be involved with making film, even if I had, if I had a chance to, of course, I'm going to make a movie. But like, one of the things, like, if somebody said you could be rich and famous making films or making books, I'd be like, look, give me books all day because it's so collaborative. Like film is so dependent on raising enough money to pay the union prop guy. You know, like there's a lot. Like when people are like, oh, money shouldn't get in the way. Like, well, money is why it happens. It's why so many people want to make movies because it's lucrative for everybody. You know, you can stand on a screen and fart and get a check for the rest of your life, you know? And the example of like Scarlett Johansson playing that character, what I don't like about it is, one, I don't care if a movie changes people's lives. So that whole argument about like, well, you know, she could have maybe opened people's minds. I don't really care about that at all. But what I do care about is something I used to never care about, which is representation. Like, I think it matters to little kids, you know, like, I mean, I thought Black Panther was a piece of shit. Like, I thought every other fucking movie Marvel made is terrible. But, you know, my buddy Damon took his little kid to go see that movie, and his little kid has a black superhero to look up to. And that more than justifies that movie. And I'm an adult, and you shouldn't care about adult opinions of superhero movies anyway. So, like, to me, like, seeing, like, you know, maybe there is a little girl like Millie, or maybe doesn't have the same condition, but is just not Hollywood, you know, and sees that and goes, oh, I can do something really cool too. And this is definitely me softening in my old age to care about like what little kids feel, you know. But
wow,
yeah.
Although envisioning some kid looking at Hereditary and thinking something aspirational is a little spurious, maybe.
No, you watch that movie, you'd be inspired, man. But the other thing about like not casting somebody, I mean, this will be my last thing on this, is if there's ever an opportunity to discover the trans male actor that you didn't know that you needed in your life, that's it. You know what I mean?
Well, you know, I think this conversation is another demonstration of the way that television is eating Hollywood, picking at the corpse of Hollywood. Is Hollywood is having these conversations about like, it can't happen unless it happens in this fucking stupid roundabout way. Blah. And then, you know, I mentioned Pose. Pose doesn't have any ultra famous people in it, and it's fucking magical. And like, TV doesn't need these things. There's plenty of very famous and renowned people who are working in television, and I'm not trying to spackle over that reality. But the fact is, a lot of amazing television is happening without these sort of needling nonsense discussions that I'm sure are happening to some degree, but they're not. We can't make Ghost in the Shell with an Asian lead, so shut up everybody about TV shows as much. Yeah. Still happening. Not nearly as much.
Yeah. I just, to me, it's also like, I get why people don't make movies with, you know, it's like millions and like $250,000 on the line every time you make one of these movies, right? And you could completely end a career of several people if a movie sucks, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, like you don't know that like Ghost in the Shell wouldn't have put a Asian actress on the fucking map.
Yeah.
It was like, you know, like, I'm totally down with having another hot Asian actress in our world. You know, why not? It's great.
I thought we were going there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's not to like about that?
All right. So,
in summation,
what have we learned, Chad?
I've learned that I like weird looking actresses. I don't care how they get that way.
Cold. Let's see. Any last things to touch on?
I'm still thinking about like this whole like exploitation of Millie sort of thing. It's like, and like actresses and like, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, I feel like great horror or scary movies often have an actual weird looking person in it, and it makes it like Deliverance, for instance. I think if you did not have the scene with the weird little kid playing banjo in the beginning, it's not nearly as an all-time great creepy movie.
True.
Yeah, and without the weird brother from Texas Chainsaw Massacre that like cuts his hand in the beginning, I don't think that movie is successful.
Right, and I was mentioning Don't Look Now, and that has this very, very tiny woman at the end who's very frightening looking, and I don't know. It's a very complicated conversation, and I tend to not think of people being exploited unless it seems like they're actually being exploited.
Yeah, I don't, I guess it's not forward in my concern library now.
It's a big concern for me, but I sort of feel like when someone's being exploited, I don't think it's like mysterious and complicated.
Yeah, like for me though, it's like exploited by being a movie star. What a problem. You know what I mean? Like, I don't mean like I don't think about people being exploited. I think about that shit constantly. Like, I just mean I don't think about like Hollywood exploitation. It's sort of like, I don't know, man. Like, if you've like made one movie this big, you're pretty much going to be set for a while if you're good with your money.
Although I'd be more concerned about her being a young Hollywood actor and the potential for Corey Feldmanism than for her looks being like, I'd be worried about like what an awful town that is if you're under if you're any age and a woman or anything, but and her looks is not the issue, I think.
No, yeah, like, I mean, like, you're in Hollywood, like, interdimensional pedophilia is, like, just right around the corner, you know, if you believe Alex Jones or anyone, really, you know.
If you believe Alex Jones or fact.
Yeah, that's one of the things where, like, you know, you feel like Alex Jones might be a little on to something, you know. Not the Pizzagate stuff, of course, but, like, there's some creepy shit that happens in Hollywood. Roman Polanski, Exhibit A, you know.
Yeah.
Like, that he's the proof. Like, don't let Roman Polanski around, little Millie. I mean, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alex Jones is the stopped clock that's right twice a day.
Yes, even the sun shines on a dog's balls every once in a while is the other expression.
I don't know that one.
It's basically the broken clock thing.
I see. All right, let's fade to black and roll the credits. Take that sunshine away. So you should subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. And while you're there, give us a rating.
Yeah, you stingy fucks. Yeah, it's been a while since anyone's given us a rating or a review. We were
just soaring for a while there.
I know. It was like, I mean, obviously, like the people who cared. And the rest of you freeloaders don't care.
I'm far more inviting and forgiving. I'm just glad you're here with us. Join the mailing list and go watch Unsane.
Yeah, I swear to God, if we don't get more ratings and reviews by the next episode, you're going to have Lethal 1, 2, 3, and 4 reviewed on this podcast.
Lethal Weapon?
Yeah, Lethal Weapon.
Oh, God.
Yeah, we're gonna Lethal Weapon. Is it horror?
Yes.
Yes.
If we can cover Forrest Gump, we can cover the Lethal Weapon movies.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening.